In our index.html page, we created this range section early on. Now this is going to update during the game to show the player the number range they have left to choose from. We're going to do this by updating these three sections. We'll be using JavaScript to set the CSS, such as the margin and also the background color. Over to our script file, and we can now set this up. The first thing I'm going to do up at the very top is to set two new variables. So these variables are going to be the low and also the high, and these are going to be updated during the game. So when we first begin our game, the low value is 1 and the highest value is 100. So let's set these defaults up. The high of 100. So to handle all of this functionality, we're going to create a new function, and this is going to be called update range. So to update our range slider, we need to access all three of these sections. So let's grab these first by the ID. So get element by ID. The first one was low, and store this inside of a constant called low value. We can duplicate this 2 more times, and the second one is the space. This is the space between the high and the low values. And the third one is high. And call this the high value. So both this low value and the high value will be the red areas, which we can see if we go into the game. This will be the low section over on the left, and then we'll update the high section over on the right. The space in between is the area which the user still has to choose from, and this is going to be a green section. So to do this inside of our script, we're going to update the CSS values of the flexbox and also the background color. So to make a space for the low section on the left hand side, we need to take into account the value of low, and we can use this as a percentage to set the flex value. So remember, when using the flexbox, if all three of these sections had an equal value of 1, these would all try to take up an equal amount of space. However, though, these sections are not going to be equal since they're going to be based on our variables. So let's begin with our low value variable. We can set the style property or flex, and this is going to be equal to our low variable. And since this is CSS, we also need to add a string onto the end, which is the percentage symbol. This would also be the same for any other values too, such as a pixel. We're also going to give this low value a background color too. So set the style.background to be equal to our background color, which is going to be EF 7B54. We're going to do a pretty similar thing for our next two sections. So let's copy these two style sections. I'm going to paste this just below our space and also the high section. So the space section is going to be everything in between. So to get this value, we're going to access the high variable and take away the low, which is going to give us the space in between. The background is going to be our green color, which is the value of 83, E1, D0. The final one is this value of high down at the bottom. Now we can't just simply output the value of high. Now this is because if we take a look at our progress bar, if the user's high guess, for example, is 70, if we add this as a value of 70, this will create a red section all the way from the left right across to 70%. However, though, we already have the low sections and the space in between. So if this was going to be a value of 70, all we want to do is to create a red section for the remaining 30% right at the end. So the way we can do this is to take this away from 100. And this will give us the remaining space to fill in the red section right at the end. We already have this red color set from before, so we can now save this and then call this function each time the user makes a guess. So our function is update range, and we can call this after each guess down in our compare guess function. So this is our compare guess. So let's select the opening brackets and let's call this just after this closes. So if we now save this file and give this a try, add some values inside of here, we'll see that nothing is working correctly just yet. This is because we are relying on both the high and also the low variables up at the very top, but we're not yet updating these with the user's guess. And we can update these two values back down in our compare guess function. So the first if section, here we're checking if the user's guess is too high, so therefore we can update our high variable with the value of the user's guess. Below this, inside of our else if section, this is when the user's guess is too low, so therefore we can update our low variable to be equal to our user's guess. So let's save this file and try this out over in the browser. So add any values inside of here, and we still don't see an update, so let's check this out. We update in the high section if the user's guess is too high. If it's too low, we update in the low section. So let's go to our function. We have our variables, update range. Now we can see from the text editor that our space and also the high value variables are not being used. So let's change this to be space. And also the same just below. These two should be high value. And I guess this is one of the downsides of copying and pasting. So let's save this and give this a go in the browser. Add any values inside of here, so 10. And the first 10% is now our low section. Let's try and add a high value of 90. This then fills in the last 10%, giving us the range in between. So let's go for 50. This now closes up. So this is pretty much all working correctly, but there is one small problem. Currently our highest value is 90, but if we were to add a higher value such as 99, we see our range now increases. When we add a higher value, we don't want our range to be increasing. We want to still stick with the previous high, which was 90. So it may sound a little confusing, but we only want to update the high variable if it was lower than the previous high. So back down to our compare function. When we set our high, we're going to create a if statement, which is going to check if our user guess is lower than the previous high. If it is, we'll then set our variable. This will stop any cases just like before when our previous high was 90 and then the user guess was 99. And an if statement like this will stop this kind of thing from happening. The same thing will happen if we go back for the low section. If we have a low of 50, this now gives us our range from 1 to 50. Let's go for 30, 10. So now our low section is between 1 and 10. If we were to add a lower value such as 5, again the same problem happens. This goes wider, where we want this to say exactly the same. So just below where we update our low section, we can also add a conditional statement. And we only want this variable to be updated if the user's guess is higher than the current low. Let's give this a test. So let's go for 10 and 90. So now let's go for the low section. If we make this lower, such as 5, this red section stays exactly where it is. We'll try going higher, so 95. And this all now seems to work correctly. Our range section is almost now done. And the next thing to do is to also update the text inside the middle. This is our current range of 1 to 100. And we also want to update this during the game. We're also going to push this over to the left or to the right to be above our green section. The place we're going to do this is back inside of our update range function. So scroll back up. We can then select this section, which is wrapped inside of this span with the ID of range output. So the first step is to grab this with get element by ID. And then store this inside of a constant called range output. We want to now grab this range output and then update the inner HTML to be the new updated values. Let's use the backtick so we can create a template string, which will allow us to insert some variables into our output. So the first variable we add inside of the dollar symbol and the curly braces. This is the value of low, which is set just above. The dash add a dollar symbol, and then we can insert our height variable inside of the curly braces. We're then going to make this section move to the left or to the right to be just above our green section. The way we can do this is by setting the margin on the left and also the right hand side. So the margin on the left is going to be the same as our low section, and the margin on the right is going to be equal to our high section. And just make sure this is dot inner text. So this will set this as the text value of our element. Again, we're going to select our range output, and we'll start with the style property, which is going to be margin left. When setting any style property using JavaScript, we don't use any dashes like we would do with CSS. Instead, we set this as camel case, so the first word of margin is all lowercase, and then each word just after this begins with a capital letter. So just as we mentioned, we're going to set this to be exactly the same as our low value. We'll then set our margin on the right. So just like above, we'll set the style, but this time the margin on the right. And this is the same as our flex value, so copy this. And let's test this out. So 10, 90. This is equal, so our text is now in the middle. Let's try 50 and 70, 85. And every time we update our range, this is now pushed just above our green section. Good, so this is the range section now completed. And the very final touch I'm going to make to this project is to also make this number section flash. The way we can do this is to add an animation to our range output and then set this inside of our CSS. So this is going to be reasonably straightforward. All we're going to do is to add a new class, and we can set this property by using class list. Class list has a method called add, which will allow us to add a new class, which we're going to call flash. We can then use this over in our styles.css. So outside of our media query, just like with any other class, we target this with the dot. And then inside of here, we can set up our animation. Our animation is going to make use of the keyframes rule. So we can set at keyframes. And this is going to allow us to set exactly what CSS properties we want to add or remove at each stage of our animation. So the animation name is going to be equal to flash. And then inside of here, we can set exactly what CSS rules we want to apply at different percentages. So at 0%, which is the very start, we can set the opacity to be a value of 1. And a value of 1 is not transparent at all. This is fully opaque. So it's exactly how the element is intended to look. However, at 50% or halfway through this animation, we're going to then reduce this opacity to be equal to 0.5. So 0 would be fully transparent or fully see-through. So this is a halfway value. Then at the end of our animation, we can set the 100% value to be back to a value of 1. Now we have this animation name of flash. We can now set this. I'm also going to set this animation to be over a duration of 1 second. And also set this as infinite, so our animation will keep running inside the browser. Let's save this and try this out. Our easy mode. And if we start our game, the class has now been added and we can see our animation has now taken effect. Congratulations, you've now reached the end of this project, and I will see you in the next one.